If you walk into the Federal Reserve Bank of New York today and descend 80 feet below street level to the bedrock of Manhattan Island, you will see one of the most heavily guarded vaults on Earth. You will see steel doors that weigh 90 tons each, designed to seal hermetically against any intrusion. You will see armed guards who have never seen sunlight during their shifts. And behind those doors, you will see gold bars stacked in cages, over 6,000 tons of the yellow metal that humans have coveted since the dawn of civilization. But here is the strange truth that the guards will not explain. Almost none of that gold belongs to the United States government. It belongs to foreign nations who no longer trust their own vaults. In 1933, the United States government declared war on gold itself, not on a foreign enemy. Not on a domestic threat, on a metal that had served as money for 5,000 years of human history. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102 on April 5th of that year, making it a federal crime for any American citizen to own gold coins, gold bullion, or gold certificates. The penalty was severe, up to 10 years in federal prison and a fine of $10,000, the equivalent of over $200,000 today. Citizens were ordered to surrender their gold to the Federal Reserve within 25 days or face prosecution as criminals. The official justification was economic emergency. The Great Depression was crushing the nation. Banks were failing by the thousands. Unemployment had reached 25%. Something had to be done, and gold, they said, was standing in the way of recovery. But the real reason was far more significant than any temporary crisis. Gold was the one thing that limited the government's power to create money from nothing. Gold was the chain that bound the Federal Reserve to fiscal discipline. Gold was the ultimate check on political authority, and that chain had to be broken. This is the story of how the United States government confiscated the wealth of its own citizens, criminalized the ownership of honest money, and laid the foundation for a century of monetary manipulation. It is the tale of how gold became the dollar's most dangerous enemy, and how that enemy was defeated not on any battlefield, but in the pages of the Federal Register. To understand why the government declared gold to be public enemy number one, we must first understand what gold represented in the monetary system that existed before 1933. Since the founding of the American Republic, the United States had operated on a gold standard, a system where every paper dollar was backed by and convertible into a fixed weight of gold held in government vaults. The Coinage Act of 1792, signed by George Washington himself, defined the dollar as 371.25 grains of pure silver or 24.75 grains of pure gold. Money was not an abstraction. Money was a physical commodity with intrinsic value that no government could create or destroy at will. This system had profound implications for the relationship between citizens and their government. When money was gold, the government could not simply print more of it to pay for wars, welfare programs, or political favors. If the Treasury wanted to spend more than it collected in taxes, it had to borrow from citizens who had gold to lend, and those citizens demanded interest and eventual repayment. The gold standard was a constitutional constraint more powerful than any written document, because it was enforced not by courts but by the laws of physics. You cannot print gold. You cannot conjure it from thin air. You must dig it from the earth at enormous cost, and that cost imposed discipline on every government that operated under the Golden Rule. The creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913 was the first major assault on this discipline. The Federal Reserve was granted the power to issue currency that was only partially backed by gold, a system called fractional reserve banking. For every dollar of gold in its vaults, the Fed could create several dollars of paper currency. This was presented as a technical improvement in monetary management, a way to provide elasticity to the currency and prevent financial panics. But it was also a fundamental weakening of the golden chain. The government could now create more money than it had gold to back, and the temptation to abuse that power was irresistible. World War I provided the first great opportunity for monetary expansion. The United States financed its participation in the war not primarily through taxation, which would have been politically unpopular, but through borrowing from the Federal Reserve, which created the money to lend. The national debt exploded from $1 billion in 1916 to $25 billion by 1919. Inflation surged. The purchasing power of the dollar declined. But the system held together because citizens still retained the right to exchange their paper dollars for gold at the fixed rate of $20.67 per ounce. That convertibility was the anchor that prevented the currency from drifting into complete worthlessness. The 1920s brought a speculative frenzy fueled by easy credit from the Federal Reserve. Stock prices soared to levels that had no relationship to underlying business values. Real estate speculation ran rampant. Americans borrowed money to buy stocks, then borrowed more money using those stocks as collateral. The Federal Reserve, rather than restraining this mania with higher interest rates and tighter credit, fed the beast with cheap money that seemed to grow on trees. When the bubble finally burst in October 1929, the crash was heard around the world. The Great Depression that followed was not simply a market correction. It was the collapse of a financial system built on fractional reserves and easy credit. Banks had lent out far more money than they had in deposits. When depositors panicked and demanded their money back, the banks could not pay. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 American banks failed, taking the savings of millions of families with them into oblivion. The crisis called for decisive action. Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated on March 4, 1933, inheriting an economy in freefall. Within a month, he would take the most radical step in American monetary history. The man who would oversee the gold confiscation was Henry Morgenthau, Jr., who would become Secretary of the Treasury in 1934, though the policy's chief architect was actually Roosevelt himself, along with his advisors from the so-called Brain Trust. Roosevelt understood something that most Americans did not fully grasp. As long as citizens could convert their paper dollars into gold, the government's power to manipulate the currency was fundamentally limited. Every time the Federal Reserve printed too many dollars, gold would flow out of the Treasury as people exercised their right to convert. The gold standard was a thermostat that automatically corrected government excess, and Roosevelt wanted to break that thermostat permanently. The legal framework for confiscation was constructed in stages, each step building on the last. On March 6, 1933, just 2 days after his inauguration, Roosevelt declared a national banking holiday, closing every bank in America for 4 days. The official reason was to prevent further bank runs. The real reason was to stop the hemorrhage of gold from the banking system. During those 4 days, while Americans could not access their own money, the administration drafted the Emergency Banking Act, which Congress passed on March 9 without most members even having time to read it. The act gave the president extraordinary powers over banking and currency, powers that would have been unthinkable in peacetime just weeks earlier. On April 5, 1933, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, the document that would criminalize gold ownership for American citizens. The order required all persons to deliver their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to a Federal Reserve Bank on or before May 1, 1933. In exchange, they would receive paper currency at the official rate of $20.67 per ounce. Anyone who refused to comply faced prosecution under the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, a wartime statute that had been amended to apply to domestic economic emergencies. Think about the implications of that legal maneuver. American citizens were being treated as enemies of their own government for the crime of holding honest money. The order contained certain exemptions that revealed its true purpose. Jewelers could keep gold needed for their trade. Dentists could keep gold for dental work. Rare coin collectors could keep coins with numismatic value exceeding their gold content. But ordinary citizens who had saved gold as a store of value, who had followed the traditional wisdom of keeping some wealth in the most reliable form known to humanity, were ordered to surrender their savings or become criminals. The message was clear. You may keep gold for ornament or industry, but you may not keep gold as money. You may not have an alternative to the paper dollars we issue. The confiscation was enforced with varying degrees of vigor across the country. Some citizens complied immediately, fearful of prosecution. Others claimed they had no gold to surrender. Still others converted their coins into jewelry or hid their bullion where the government could not find it. The Treasury Department estimated that Americans held approximately $400 million in gold coins before the order, but only about $190 million was actually surrendered. Half the gold simply disappeared into hiding, a silent act of civil disobedience by citizens who refused to trust their government with their savings. But the confiscation was only the first half of the scheme. The second half came in January 1934 with the Gold Reserve Act, which completed the transformation of the American monetary system. This act transferred all gold held by the Federal Reserve banks to the Treasury Department, creating a consolidated government monopoly on the monetary metal. More significantly, it authorized the president to revalue gold, to change the official price at which the Treasury would buy and sell the metal. Roosevelt used this authority immediately. On January 31, 1934, he raised the official gold price from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce, an increase of almost 70%. Consider what this revaluation meant for those who had obeyed the law. A citizen who had surrendered 100 ounces of gold in May 1933 had received $2,067 in paper currency. 8 months later, that same gold was worth $3,500 at the new official price. The government had effectively stolen 40% of the value from everyone who had complied with the confiscation order. Those who had hidden their gold, who had broken the law, were rewarded with a massive windfall. The honest were punished. The disobedient were enriched. This was the moral universe created by the gold ban. The official justification for the revaluation was that it would stimulate the economy by increasing the money supply. With gold worth more in dollar terms, the Treasury could issue more paper currency against its gold holdings. Prices would rise, the theory went, and rising prices would cure the Depression by making debts easier to repay. It was an elegant theory that ignored a fundamental reality. The Depression was caused not by insufficient money, but by malinvestment and debt that could not be repaid regardless of how many dollars were printed. The revaluation helped debtors at the expense of creditors, helped those who had borrowed recklessly at the expense of those who had saved prudently. It was a massive transfer of wealth engineered by government decree. Not everyone accepted this transformation quietly. The gold confiscation faced legal challenge from citizens who argued that the government had no constitutional authority to void contracts that specified payment in gold or to confiscate private property without just compensation. The cases reached the Supreme Court in 1935, known collectively as the Gold Clause cases. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, writing for a 5-4 majority, upheld the government's power to regulate the monetary system, including the power to abrogate gold clauses in private contracts. The dissenting justices were scathing. Justice James McReynolds declared from the bench that the Constitution as we have known it is gone, that this is Nero at his worst. But the majority ruled, and the gold confiscation stood. The gold ban of 1933 was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a 40-year war against the metal that would culminate in the complete abandonment of gold backing for the dollar. The tipping point arrived on August 15, 1971, when President Richard Nixon appeared on national television to announce what he called a temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. It was not temporary. It was the final severance of the last golden thread that connected American currency to physical reality. To understand why Nixon was forced to act, we must trace the consequences of the 1933 confiscation through the intervening decades. The Bretton Woods system established in 1944 had created a global monetary order based on the dollar, with other currencies pegged to the dollar, and the dollar alone convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. But this convertibility was limited. Only foreign governments and central banks could exchange their dollars for gold, not private citizens or businesses. The American public remained forbidden from owning monetary gold, while foreigners could accumulate it at the fixed price whenever the United States ran deficits. And run deficits the United States did. The costs of maintaining a global military empire, of fighting wars in Korea and Vietnam, of building the Great Society welfare programs at home, far exceeded what the government collected in taxes. The difference was made up by printing dollars, which flowed out of the United States to pay for imports and foreign military bases. Foreign central banks accumulated these dollars in their reserves. At first, they were content to hold paper, trusting in American promises. But as the dollars piled up and American gold reserves dwindled, that trust began to erode. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, was the first major power to call America's bluff. De Gaulle understood that the United States was exploiting what he called an exorbitant privilege, the ability to pay for real goods with paper currency that cost nothing to produce. In 1965, France began systematically converting its dollar reserves into gold, sending ships across the Atlantic to collect the metal from the vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Other nations followed the French lead. Between 1958 and 1971, American gold reserves fell from over 20,000 tons to just under 9,000 tons. The gold was flowing out faster than the government could stop it. By the summer of 1971, the situation had become critical. Britain requested conversion of $3 billion into gold. Other nations were queuing up behind them. At the official price of $35 per ounce, the remaining American gold reserves were worth only about $10 billion, but foreign governments held claims on over $50 billion. There was simply not enough gold to honor the commitments. The Treasury faced a choice: defend the gold price by drastically cutting spending and raising interest rates, which would cause a severe recession, or abandon the gold commitment entirely and let the dollar float. Nixon chose the latter. On that August evening in 1971, he announced to a stunned nation and world that the gold window was closing. The dollar would no longer be redeemable in gold at any price. This was presented as an attack on speculators, as a defense of the American worker against unfair foreign competition. In reality, it was the final admission that the government had printed more dollars than it could ever redeem, that the promises made in 1944 were worthless, that the golden anchor had been cut loose forever. The immediate aftermath was chaos in the currency markets. The dollar plunged against other major currencies. The price of gold, which had been fixed at $35 for 37 years, began a dizzying ascent. By 1974, gold had reached $195 per ounce. By 1980, it would touch $850, a 24-fold increase from the official price that Nixon had abandoned. Those Americans who had defied the law, who had hidden their gold despite the threat of imprisonment, saw their forbidden savings multiply in value beyond anything they could have imagined. Those who had trusted in paper dollars saw their purchasing power erode with every passing year. The gold ban itself would not be lifted until December 31, 1974, when President Gerald Ford signed legislation permitting American citizens to own gold once again after 41 years of prohibition. But by then, the damage was done. An entire generation of Americans had grown up without any concept of money as something that must be earned, saved, and preserved. Money had become whatever the government said it was, created and destroyed by bureaucratic decree. The golden discipline that had constrained governments for millennia was gone, replaced by the discretion of central bankers who answered to no one. But the bankers and politicians who destroyed the gold standard had no intention of allowing gold to reclaim its monetary role. They understood that as long as gold existed as an alternative to their paper currencies, it would serve as a constant reminder of their monetary mismanagement, a barometer that measured the declining purchasing power of the dollar with uncomfortable precision. Gold had to be not merely banned, but discredited, demonetized, reduced to just another commodity like copper or zinc. The campaign against gold took multiple forms over the following decades. Central banks, which held enormous gold reserves accumulated over centuries, became active sellers rather than buyers. Between 1999 and 2002, the Bank of England under Chancellor Gordon Brown sold over half of Britain's gold reserves, approximately 400 tons, at prices that would later prove to be the lowest in 20 years. The Swiss National Bank sold over 1,000 tons. Other European central banks joined the selling, flooding the market and suppressing prices. The message to private citizens was clear. If governments themselves were dumping gold, what business did ordinary people have in holding it? Consider how this system worked against the interests of ordinary savers. If a worker in 1971 had saved $1,000 in a bank account, the purchasing power of that money would have declined by over 85% by 2024 due to inflation. The dollars were still there, the numbers on the statement unchanged, but what those dollars could buy had shrunk to a fraction of its original value. The silent theft of inflation took more from American savers than any burglar could have stolen, but no one went to prison for this crime because the crime was committed by the government itself. Meanwhile, if that same worker had hidden $1,000 worth of gold in 1971, defying the law that was still in effect, that gold would be worth over $60,000 today. The metal that the government had confiscated, criminalized, and demonized proved to be the only reliable store of value across the decades. The government's war on gold was ultimately a war on the ability of ordinary citizens to preserve the fruits of their labor from monetary debasement. The consequences of the gold ban extended far beyond individual savings into the very structure of the global economy. Without the golden anchor, governments were free to run deficits of any size. financing their spending not through taxation or honest borrowing, but through the creation of money from nothing. The United States national debt, which had taken 200 years to reach $1 trillion by 1982, would reach $10 trillion by 2008 and $34 trillion by 2024. Each dollar of that debt represented a claim on future productivity, a burden placed on children not yet born by politicians seeking votes in the present. The financial system that emerged from the wreckage of the gold standard was built on debt rather than savings, on leverage rather than equity, on promises rather than production. Banks could create money through lending, conjuring purchasing power from accounting entries. Governments could bail out failed institutions by printing whatever was needed. The moral hazard was total. Those who took risks knew they would keep the profits while losses would be socialized through inflation or taxpayer bailouts. The discipline that gold had imposed was replaced by the discretion of central bankers, and that discretion was exercised consistently in favor of debtors over creditors, of spenders over savers, of the connected over the common. If a farmer worked his fields in Kansas and sold his wheat for dollars, the purchasing power of those dollars was determined not by the productivity of his labor, but by the decisions of the Federal Reserve. If a factory worker in Ohio saved for retirement over 30 years, the value of her savings depended on whether the central bank decided to inflate or deflate the currency. If a family in California bought a house with a mortgage, they were betting that inflation would reduce the real value of their debt faster than it eroded their wages. Every economic decision became a speculation on the actions of monetary authorities who operated behind closed doors with no democratic accountability. The gold that was confiscated in 1933 never returned to the American people. It sits today in Fort Knox, Kentucky, and in the vaults beneath the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, supposedly still owned by the United States Treasury, though no full independent audit has been permitted in over 70 years. Some analysts question whether all the gold is actually there, whether it has been leased or sold in secret arrangements that would embarrass the government if revealed. The opacity is itself a confession. A government confident in its holdings would welcome verification. The refusal to permit audits suggests that the truth might be inconvenient. Between 1933 and 2024, the dollar has lost approximately 98% of its purchasing power as measured against consumer prices. A basket of goods that cost $1 in 1933 costs over $20 today. This is not natural economic evolution. This is the direct consequence of abandoning the golden anchor that had preserved the dollar's value for over a century. The gold ban did not save America from the Depression. The Depression continued for years after the confiscation. What the gold ban accomplished was the transfer of power from citizens to government, from savers to debtors, from the productive to the politically connected. The gold ban of 1933 remains one of the most consequential and least discussed events in American economic history. It was the moment when the relationship between citizens and their money was fundamentally transformed, when savings became subject to government manipulation, when the concept of sound money was replaced by the reality of managed currency. The lessons of that confiscation echo through every financial crisis, every inflation surge, every monetary intervention in the decades since. The story of the gold ban is the ultimate lesson in the danger of trusting governments with monetary power. The founders of the American Republic understood this danger, which is why the Constitution specified that only gold and silver could serve as legal tender for the payment of debts. They had seen the continental currency become worthless during the Revolution, had watched paper money destroy fortunes and corrupt commerce. But their constitutional protections were circumvented through clever legal arguments and emergency powers that never quite ended. Today, a new generation is discovering what the gold ban generation learned through bitter experience. That paper money backed by nothing but government promises is ultimately a claim on faith, and that faith can be betrayed. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies have emerged as alternative monetary systems precisely because people no longer trust central banks to preserve the value of their savings. The technology is different, but the impulse is the same. The desire for money that cannot be printed, devalued, or confiscated at political whim. But the history of the gold ban teaches us that governments do not surrender monetary power willingly. When alternatives to their currencies arise, whether gold in 1933 or cryptocurrencies today, the regulatory apparatus mobilizes to suppress, control, or co-opt the threat. The playbook has not changed. First comes the crisis, real or manufactured. Then comes the emergency authority. Then comes the permanent alteration of the rules that benefit those in power at the expense of those without it. Remember that the gold ban was presented as a temporary measure to address an emergency. The emergency passed. The ban endured for 41 years. The prohibition on gold clauses in contracts was not lifted until 1977, and the golden anchor that had stabilized the American monetary system for a century never returned. Remember that when governments tell you gold is a barbarous relic, they are telling you that the discipline which constrained their power is obsolete. Remember that when they promise to manage the currency responsibly, they are asking you to trust the same institutions that have presided over a 98% decline in the dollar's purchasing power. Remember that the war on gold was always a war on your ability to save. The gold that was confiscated from American citizens in 1933 still rests in government vaults, 90 feet below the streets of Manhattan and in the hills of Kentucky. It is the physical memorial to a broken promise, to a theft that was called economic policy, to a confiscation that was called patriotic duty. The citizens who surrendered their gold trusted their government. They were rewarded with a 40% haircut when the gold was revalued, and with decades of inflation that devoured whatever paper they received in exchange. Gold was not the enemy of prosperity. Gold was the enemy of unlimited government power, and that is why it had to be destroyed.